Hi, this is Mahavandas. Welcome to Simple Gita, Chapter 2. This chapter is entitled, The Contents of the Gita Summarised. Let's take a look at the connection between it and the previous chapter. In the previous chapter, Sanjaya concluded that Arjuna was not inclined to fight. Hearing this made Dhrtarastra joyful as he envisioned his sons keeping the kingdom. In this chapter, Sanjaya, seeing Dhrtarastra hopeful of keeping the kingdom for his sons, begins to describe how Krishna inspires Arjuna to fight. And here's our overview of the chapter. Chapter 2, the contents of the Gita Summarised, summarises three types of yoga: karma yoga, jnana-yoga, and the complete yoga, Bhakti. These three subjects are the contents for the whole Gita. In summary, Krishna presents an analytical study of the material body and the spirit soul, acting with and without attachment to the results of one's actions, and the characteristics of a self-realized person. Let's check out the first verse and purport for this chapter from the Bhagavad Gita as it is. Sanjaya said, seeing Arjuna full of compassion, his mind depressed, his eyes full of tears, Madhusudana, Krishna, spoke the following words. Srila Prabhupada's purport. Material compassion, lamentation, and tears are all signs of ignorance of the real self. Compassion for the eternal soul is self-realization. The word Madhusudana is significant in this verse. Lord Krishna killed the demon Madhu, and now Arjuna wanted Krishna to kill the demon of misunderstanding that had overtaken him in the discharge of his duty. No one knows where compassion should be applied. Compassion for the dress of a drowning man is senseless. A man fallen in the ocean of nescience cannot be saved simply by rescuing his outward dress, the gross material body. One who does not know this and laments for the outward dress is called a Shudra, or one who laments unnecessarily. Arjuna was a Kshatriya, and this conduct was not expected from him. Lord Krishna, however, can dissipate the lamentation of the ignorant man, and for this purpose the Bhagavad Gita was sung by him. This chapter instructs us in self-realization by an analytical study of the material body and the spirit soul, as explained by the Supreme Authority Lord Sri Krishna. This realization is possible when one works without attachment to fruitive results and is situated in the fixed conception of the real self. Let's go over the key points in this chapter. The first key point we get is Arjuna's indecision and accepting Krishna as his spiritual guide. But before we hear about this, Krishna tries to correct Arjuna. We heard the first verse, seeing Arjuna full of compassion, his mind depressed, his eyes full of tears, Madhusudana, Krishna, spoke the following words. My dear Arjuna, how have these impurities come upon you? They are not at all befitting a man who knows the value of life. They lead not to higher planets, but to infamy. O son of Pritha, do not yield to this degrading impotence. It does not become you. Give up such petty weakness of heart, and arise, O chastiser of the enemy. So this is Krishna's preliminary attempt to correct Arjuna here on the battlefield. But Arjuna has not yet accepted Krishna as his spiritual guide. So we'll hear Arjuna's response to these preliminary attempts of Krishna. He says, O killer of enemies, O killer of Madhu, how can I counterattack with arrows in battle men like Bhishma and Drona who are worthy of my worship? It would be better to live in this world by begging than to live at the cost of the lives of great souls who are my teachers. Even though desiring worldly gain, they are superiors. If they are killed, everything we enjoy will be tainted with blood. Then we hear Arjuna's fifth reason for not wanting to fight. That reason is indecision. He just doesn't know which is better, conquering the enemy or being conquered by them. And Arjuna concludes that even a prosperous, unrivaled kingdom on earth, with sovereignty like the demigods or the higher beings in the heavenly planets, would not solve his problem here on the battlefield. But Arjuna accepts Krishna as his teacher. This is the watershed moment in the Gita, when Arjuna stops putting forward his own ideas and begins to hear from a genuine spiritual authority. He says, "Now I'm confused about my duty and have lost all composure because of miserly weakness. In this condition, I'm asking you, Krishna, to tell me for certain what is best for me. Now I'm your disciple and a soul surrendered unto you. Please instruct me." This is the beginning of all genuine spiritual pursuits, understanding that we can't solve our problems by any material adjustment or any material measure, and therefore accepting the guidance of a bona fide spiritual teacher. Srila Prabhupada explains in his purport to this verse, "By nature's own way, the complete system of material activities is a source of perplexity for everyone. In every step there is perplexity, and therefore it behooves one to approach a bona fide spiritual master who can give one proper guidance for executing the purpose of life. All Vedic literatures advise us to approach a bona fide spiritual master to get free from the perplexities of life which happen without our desire. They are like a forest fire that somehow blazes without being set by anyone. Similarly, the world's situation is such that perplexities of life automatically appear without our wanting such confusion. No one wants fire, and yet it takes place, and we become perplexed. The Vedic wisdom therefore advises that in order to solve the perplexities of life and to understand the science of the solution, one must approach a spiritual master who is in the disciplic succession. A person with a bona fide spiritual master is supposed to know everything. One should not therefore remain in material perplexities, but should approach a spiritual master. This is the purport of this verse. So this is where the Bhagavad Gita really begins, when Krishna is accepted by Arjuna as spiritual guide. So then Krishna, being accepted in that way by Arjuna, begins to instruct him, presenting his analysis of the body and the real self, or the soul. That is the next key point in this chapter. Taking the role as Arjuna's spiritual guide, Krishna begins to dispel his grief here on the battlefield by explaining that it's foolish to lament for the material body, saying that only an uneducated person does this. Why is it foolish? Because we are not the body. We are eternal souls who change material bodies life after life. Krishna explained, "Never was there a time when I did not exist, nor you, nor all these kings, nor in the future shall any of us cease to be." As the embodied soul continuously passes in this body, from childhood to youth to old age, the soul similarly passes into another body at death. A sober person is not bewildered by such a change. Krishna is giving here the beginning of spiritual knowledge, that there's a difference between the body and the soul. We, in ordinary consciousness, accept the body as the soul or the self. In other words, we think, I am my particular body. But this is an illusion. This is not actually the case. And Krishna gives a practical example of how that's not the case in text 13 by explaining that we've all had the experience of changing bodies, or in other words, being different from the body, even in this life. We've all had a baby's body, a child's body, a teenager's body. Perhaps now we're in our adult body, or we may be in an older person's body. So we've changed so many bodies, even in this life, but we are still the same person throughout all those changes. We are the observer of the changing body who is not changing in its core identity. So in this very practical example, Krishna is illustrating the basics of spiritual life, that we are not the body, we are eternal spirit souls. And even though the body is constantly changing from childhood to youth to old age, we are not changing because we are eternal. And what we call death is simply another change of body. It's the final change of body for this lifetime, and it signals that we will then transmigrate to another body. And as we'll hear in the 8th chapter, that transmigration of the soul from body to body takes place according to the consciousness that the soul has generated in its present life. That's what determines the next body that we get, the body in the next life. So Krishna goes on to explain that understanding this, one should tolerate dualities like happiness and distress. Arjuna is here on the battlefield, he's in a lot of distress. Krishna is saying that you should tolerate that distress. It's just produced by the body, and you shouldn't take it so seriously. He says it's just like the winter and summer seasons that come and go of their own accord. Similarly, the happiness and distress produced by the body, it comes and goes. It's temporary. It's not something that you should take so seriously. You should tolerate that happiness and distress of the body, which is temporary, and you should just continue to act properly. And he explains that such dutiful action helps us to realize that we're different from our material body, and that qualifies us for freedom from birth and death, or the process of samsara, the process of changing one temporary body after another, which in of itself encompasses so many different types of misery and suffering. So this is the way out of misery and suffering, to understand that we are not our body, but the body produces temporary happiness and distress. Rather than acting according to that temporary happiness and distress, we should act according to what is right. And in this way, we become qualified to actually understand, to realize that we're different from our body. And with that realization, we can then end the process of changing material bodies. Krishna explains that the soul never dies, it's eternal, but the material body has to perish. That's its nature. And that he explains that changing bodies is similar to changing clothes, that as our clothes wear out, we discard them and we get new clothes. So similarly for the soul, this process of transmigrating from material body to material body is something like that. The bodies are just like garments that we wear for a short period of time, and they wear out. And so when they wear out, we get another body. Is there any evidence for the existence of the soul? Krishna, of course, has given our own experience of being a soul who's changing temporary bodies in this life. Is there anything else that we can use as evidence for the existence of the soul? Krishna explains that the soul is too subtle to be directly perceived with our material senses. In other words, the senses of the material body are not powerful enough to directly perceive the presence of the soul. However, we can understand its existence indirectly through the presence of consciousness, which he explains is the energy of the soul. A metaphor that's often given here is the energy of the sun or the sunshine. We can understand that the sun is present even if we can't directly see it by the presence of light, the light coming from the sun, which is the sun's energy. So similarly, even if we can't directly perceive the soul with our material senses, we can indirectly understand that it exists through the presence of consciousness, conscious awareness. That is the energy of the soul, just as the sunlight is the energy of the sun. So what actually happens at the time of death when somebody dies? The soul, evidenced by consciousness, leaves the body, and therefore the body is called dead. Let's take the example of a funeral. If you go to a funeral and let's say there's an open casket there, you will see the body of the departed person, and you will generally hear relatives and friends of the departed person lamenting that the person has gone or the person has passed on. Of course, whatever they saw of the person is still there. So who is it, or what is it that they're referring to when they say he or she is gone or passed on? Intuitively, they can understand that the real person is somewhere else. Even though the body that they thought was the person is still there, the actual person, the soul, has now moved on. So this is a practical experience that we all have at the time of death, that there is a difference between the body and the soul, even though we can't see the soul. So Krishna describes the qualities of the soul in this section. He describes the soul as unborn, eternal, ever-existing, and primeval, and never slain when the body is slain. Therefore, he concludes that one shouldn't lament for the soul because the soul can never be killed. He says, "He who dwells in the body can never be slain, therefore you need not grieve for any living being." So this argument defeats Arjuna's reason of compassion. Remember, he was compassionate to the soldiers on the battlefield. He didn't want to see them die. But Krishna's just explained in this first attempt to help Arjuna that the soul, or the actual person within the body, can never be killed. As Srila Prabhupada says in today's purport, material compassion, lamentation, and tears are all signs of ignorance of the real self. Compassion for the eternal soul is self-realization. Now, the next key point in the chapter is Krishna explaining that material happiness is generated by following authorized, prescribed material duties, occupational engagements, which are given in the yoga texts. Krishna advises that Arjuna should fight because it is his prescribed occupational duty as a military general. In other words, he's doing the right thing. By acting properly in this way, he can attain higher destinations in the next life, but by refusing to fight, he will attain the opposite. He'll get negative karma. That will mean a disadvantaged situation in the next life, and he'll also incur in this life infamy and criticism for abandoning his duty. If he fights, though, he gains either in victory or in defeat. If he wins the battle, he gains the kingdom and enjoys the kingdom, and if he is defeated, he goes to higher realms in his next life because he's acting properly. So this argument defeats Arjuna's reason of not attaining any happiness even in victory, because material happiness comes from following authorized, prescribed occupational duties. The next key point in the chapter, Krishna explains, is detached work without karmic reactions. So Krishna explains that by being equipoised amidst the dualities of happiness and distress, as he talked about previously, loss and gain, victory or defeat, which are always present in this world due to the material body, one who performs their duty because it's the right thing to do never incurs negative karma. This argument defeats Arjuna's reason of incurring negative karma. Actually, the opposite is true. If he doesn't fight the battle, he will incur negative karma because he's abandoning his proper duty. Next, Krishna explains that actions on the spiritual platform bring results which are never lost, unlike the results we get from any material action, which are certainly lost at the time of death and generally before. But with spiritual activities, whatever results we attain through our genuine spiritual endeavors, they stay with us and they go with us from life to life and accumulate until we attain spiritual perfection. So that is the significant difference between genuine spiritual activities and material activities. Krishna also explains in this section what real intelligence is, and that is intelligence which is focused on spiritual advancement. And he explains that in order to be successful on the spiritual path, one does have to be one-pointed, resolute in purpose. Now, of course, that's true even in the material sense as well. If we're going to be successful at anything worthwhile, even in the ordinary sense, we really do have to be focused on it, and we have to avoid distractions. So that's certainly the case also in spiritual endeavors. Now, this defeats Arjuna's argument of indecision, not knowing what the best thing to do is. Krishna is explaining that one must approach a genuine spiritual authority, as Arjuna has done, and actually find out what is the best thing to do in any given situation. And then one has to develop one-pointed determination to act for that ultimate good. Otherwise, one will always be confused. In this section, Krishna also explains that most people who accept some kind of authorized, revealed knowledge accept that for material prosperity. They don't actually understand that the real purpose of this kind of wisdom is spiritual advancement. You can think here prosperity religion. So this is not the actual purpose of any kind of revealed knowledge. The real purpose of revealed knowledge, as contained in various bodies of information throughout the world, is eternal advancement, the ultimate good, reviving our relationship with the Supreme. Here, Krishna defeats Arjuna's argument of destruction of the family as well by explaining that all the purposes of yoga wisdom can be served to one who knows its ultimate purpose, just as all the purposes of a small well can be served by a great reservoir of water. In other words, by serving the ultimate purpose of yoga wisdom, then one will serve all the purposes, the indirect purposes of that wisdom, such as preserving the family. Krishna then explains how to practically apply the knowledge that he explained at the beginning of the chapter, that we are not our bodies, we are eternal souls. And he explains the benefits of doing this. One is freed from karma and ultimately promoted to the spiritual world. So the practical application of this knowledge that we are not the body, we are a spirit soul, is called Bhakti Yoga, or devotional service. And that is the art of acting simply for the pleasure of the Supreme. Krishna explains here, O Arjuna, keep all abominable activities far distant by devotional service, and in that consciousness surrender unto the Lord. Those who want to enjoy the fruits of their work are misers. Those engaged in devotional service rid themselves of both good and bad reactions, even in this life. Therefore, strive for yoga, which is the art of all work. By thus engaging in devotional service, great sages or devotees free themselves from the results of action in the material world. In this way, they become free from the cycle of birth and death and attain the state beyond all miseries by going back to the spiritual world. And the final key point we get in this chapter is Krishna's explanation of the characteristics of a self-realized person. Now, this explanation is prompted by a question by Arjuna, who asks how to recognize someone who has actually achieved the result of acting according to the knowledge that Krishna had just explained. In other words, how does one recognize a self-realized soul? Krishna explains that the symptoms of such a person, in essence, culminate in the person being free from all kinds of self-centered desire. He says, when a man gives up all varieties of self-centered desire, which arise from mental concoction, and when his mind, thus purified, finds satisfaction in the self alone, then he is said to be in pure transcendental consciousness. So a self-realized person is not necessarily identified through externals. The clothing that the person wears, whether the person has long hair or short hair or a beard or belongs to a certain religious or spiritual group. These are not the ultimate barometer of a truly self-realized person. The actual barometer is that such a person must be free from mental concoction. The mind, it likes to concoct or just come up with so many desires on how we can satisfy ourselves in this world separate from the Supreme. But when one is purified of all those concoctions and finds satisfaction in the self alone, then the person is considered to be an actual transcendentalist, an actual self-realized soul. So we hear in this section how such a person is equipoised amidst the dualities of the world. We've heard that a couple of times in this chapter. That means that in happiness or distress, loss or gain, victory or defeat, they're always equipoised. They're not affected by these things. And such a person, Krishna explains here, also has full control over their mind and their senses. And this is due to experiencing a higher spiritual pleasure. Srila Prabhupada explains in his purport to this text that we just quoted, one has to give up all kinds of sense desire manufactured by mental concoction. Artificially, such sense desires cannot be stopped. But if one is engaged in Krishna consciousness, then automatically sense desires subside without extraneous efforts. Therefore, one has to engage himself in Krishna consciousness without hesitation, for this devotional service will instantly help one onto the platform of transcendental consciousness. The highly developed soul always remains satisfied in himself by realizing himself as the eternal servitor of the Supreme Lord. Such a transcendentally situated person has no sense desires resulting from petty materialism. Rather, he remains always happy in his natural position of eternally serving the Supreme Lord. Krishna refers to such a person as a sage of steady mind and explains that such a rare individual attains the highest perfection at the end of life by returning to the spiritual world. So that is the conclusion of this chapter. Now let's do a quick summary of what we've heard. In this chapter, we've heard Arjuna's indecision and his acceptance of Krishna as his spiritual guide. Krishna began his instruction to Arjuna with an analysis of the material body and the spirit soul, concluding that the body can never be saved while the soul can never be killed. We've heard how material happiness is generated by following prescribed occupational duties as given in yoga wisdom, how to perform detached work without karmic reactions for the pleasure of the Supreme, and the characteristics of a self-realized person, one who is free from all self-centered desire. With this qualification, the sage of steady mind enters the spiritual world at the time of death. So in this chapter, Krishna has defeated all of Arjuna's arguments for not wanting to fight the battle. Arjuna's argument of compassion for friends and relatives was defeated by Krishna explaining that actually no one will die in the battle because we're all eternal souls. Arjuna's argument of not enjoying even in victory was defeated by Krishna explaining that material happiness is actually generated by following authorized prescribed duties. So, because his prescribed duty is to fight the battle, if he wins, he gains the kingdom and he enjoys, and if he loses, he goes to higher realms in the next life and enjoys material happiness there. So in either case, he will be happy. Arjuna's argument of fear of negative karma, Krishna defeated by explaining that if he fights for the right cause, he accrues no negative karma. And if he fights as a service to the supreme cause, then he gets no karma at all and ends his cycle of samsara, or repeated birth and death. Arjuna's argument of destruction of the family was also defeated in this chapter by Krishna, when Krishna explained that by acting according to the ultimate purpose of yoga wisdom, which is devotional service to Krishna, he'll actually be serving all the preliminary purposes of that wisdom and that culture, such as preserving the family, and be acting in everyone's highest self-interest. And his final argument, that of indecision, not knowing what the best thing to do was, to fight or not fight, Krishna defeated that by explaining that one must actually understand the ultimate good from a genuine authority and then develop one-pointed intelligence and determination to act for that ultimate good. Perhaps Arjuna's argument of compassion is the one that we can resonate with the most. However, as we hear in this chapter, although his compassion was well-intentioned, we hear that it was also misdirected, because he was in the bodily concept of life, thinking that I am this body and everybody on the battlefield is also their body. He was showing compassion towards the bodies of the soldiers on the battlefield instead of the real people, instead of the eternal souls within those bodies. As Srila Prabhupada explained in the first purport that we read, no one knows where compassion should be applied. Compassion for the dress of a drowning man is senseless. A man fallen in the ocean of nescience cannot be saved simply by rescuing his outward dress, the gross material body. So Arjuna's compassion was something like that. It's like someone showing compassion for the dress of a drowning person and forgetting about the person who's drowning. So this exemplifies the basic illusion that affects all conditioned souls in this world. Forgetful of our spiritual identity, we think that we are our material body, and therefore that material experiences, material relationships, material acquisitions are everything. So Bhagavad Gita reveals this illusion as the root cause of all our lamentation, as graphically demonstrated here by Arjuna. We'll conclude with Srila Prabhupada explaining, Lord Krishna, however, can dissipate the lamentation of the ignorant man, and for this purpose the Bhagavad Gita was sung by him. This chapter instructs us in self-realization by an analytical study of the material body and the spirit soul, as explained by the Supreme Authority, Lord Sri Krishna. This realization is possible when one works without attachment to fruitive results and is situated in the fixed conception of the real self. So Krishna will explain this process of realization in more detail in the next chapter. Let's preview that chapter, which is called Karma Yoga. Krishna elaborates on Karma Yoga, or the art of acting for the Supreme and thus avoiding karmic reactions. He also describes the enemy of such enlightened action, self-centered desire, and how it can be defeated by spiritual intelligence. Thanks so much for joining me in the class today on the second chapter of the Bhagavad Gita, the contents of the Gita Summarised, and I look forward to your good company in the next class on chapter 3, Karma Yoga.